Pete Hegseth gave a speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue. It really was a change of tone from previous speeches that have been given by American representatives. And interesting, normally actually the Chinese attend these conferences. This year, the Chinese did not attend. And he gave a very fiery speech directed against China. He said that the threat from China is imminent. And he's essentially saying that, war is a real possibility. We have to prepare for it. You must start increasing your defense budgets. He sounded like maybe like Keir Starmer or Merz does in Europe. He's trying to do the same thing in China. Now, a lot of these countries are part of what you could say are U.S.-led security arrangements, but they also have very, very close ties, obviously, to China. China is the behemoth in the area, and especially an economic behemoth, and so they have very substantial trade links. And I think this is not something they wanted to hear, but he pushed it. He pushed it hard and said, I said again that Taiwan may very well be the trigger of a war. We hope it doesn't happen. We need to establish deterrence. They're saying, you need to build up your defense budgets and whatever. But if the deterrence doesn't work, then we'll have to go, he's essentially saying the U.S. to war and to win this war. So it was, a very, let's say, combative speech, and a very hostile, hostile against the China. So there's that. There is a rising temperature, let's say, in the region over the potential of a military conflict. At the same time, okay, go ahead.
I was just saying, I have a short clip from that speech he gave in Singapore. I think maybe I can play it real quick, so people can see.
Again, to be clear, any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be.
Okay, that's just a small excerpt, but I think it kind of captures that sentiment that of like we need to gear up for a potential war with China.
Right.
Crazy.
Right.
It's really crazy.
Yeah. And I think also I want to point out that he, again, in the past, the U.S. maintained, a policy of strategic ambiguity. Essentially, if they made it purposely unclear as to how they would respond to an attempt to militarily reunify China. Like, in other words, if mainland China made an attempt to just take back Taiwan by military force, they wouldn't state what their response would be. That's strategic ambiguity. Maybe we would do nothing, but maybe we would, intervene militarily. But that strategic ambiguity began to disappear actually under Biden, who I think 4 different times said that they would fight back. I think each time, like the Secretary or the State Department would walk back his comments, but it happened 4 times. And so, that raised eyebrows around the world, and especially in China. And then the way he's talking now is the same thing. It just would mean war. Because one thing that has to be remembered is that China, first of all, regards Taiwan as its own territory. That's always been its policy, ever since the PRC's policy, ever since it took power in 1949, or at least shortly after 1949. It is the understanding of more importantly, of actually the U.S. The U.S. State Department also regards Taiwan as Chinese territory. And they said, yes, they they agree that actually Taiwan needs to be reunified with China over time, but they express the hope that this will happen peacefully. That was the policy, but we are clearly drifting away from it. And we're starting to look at Taiwan as sort of an outpost of our military power, or, a proxy against China. And I think you can see that the spirit of that new thinking in Pete Hegseth's speech.
What do most of the Taiwanese feel? Do they Do they want to be a proxy? I mean, you think that if they're watching what's happened in Ukraine,
Right.
and you just sort of see this general shift in power of just what we've talked about in the beginning of this conversation, like, this is crazy. No way. Get out of here, America. Don't use this as a battering ram against China.
Yeah. Well, the current ruling party, which it has to be said actually doesn't even have didn't win with a majority of the vote. They won with a plurality. Okay, they are they are in favor of, you could say, a kind of almost a proxy relationship with the U.S. They're kind of like the ultra-nationalists. They are, the Taiwanese nationalists within Taiwan. And they have been pushing the envelope. They have been going right up to the red lines that China has declared. They're careful so far not to cross them. But they understand, or they believe, I should say, that the U.S. will back them, and that empowers them to pursue reckless and provocative policies vis-a-vis mainland China. So that's the ruling party right now. It's the Minjindang, which is means like the People's Progressive Party, but it's a nationalist party. Again, it's a different kind of nationalism, a different flavor from what you have in Ukraine, but it is a nationalism, and it's a nationalism like the Ukrainian nationalists feel empowered by U.S. backing. Then the majority of people, I think, would prefer to maintain the status quo in Taiwan, which is to say that, okay, we're not actually a separate country, but not officially, but de facto we are. Let's get along with China because, hey, this relationship is very good for business, and it has been. Obviously, there are the economies are very extensively linked, and to the mutual benefit of both sides. And so I think most people have that attitude. And then there are some. I really don't know what the percentage is, but it's true, for example, of your aunts in Taiwan that would just as soon, especially one of them, and I don't think she's totally fringe, but actually would just as soon would like to have Taiwan become part of China, not just not just on paper, but in a really substantive way, become a province of China, which is technically it is, but de facto it is not at this point. And I think it's understandable. Those kind of people were very, very unusual and tended to be hard left people in Taiwan. Actually, I remember meeting one at the Chinese school that I attended decades ago in Taiwan. But things have changed, and so it's actually people that are more conservative or traditional actually favor unification with China now, and because they see that China is doing well, it's prospering, it's communist, but really in name only. It's a nationalist government that has really delivered the goods for its people, and they would like to be a part of it. They're proud of what they've done, and they consider themselves, say, we're Chinese, which clearly they are. Again, you have the same kind of thing happening that you have in Ukraine, where a lot of people want to pretend, especially on the nationalist side, that we're not Chinese. They don't have it. We're completely different people. But there are deep historical links, and it's hard to pretend that actually you're not. Even if you speak, the Taiwanese language and you're a nationalist, so many of your customs and attitudes are just fundamentally Chinese. And I think you would actually find the same thing in Ukraine, even among the nationalists. There's this pretense, this idea that we have no relationship, neither blood links or, cultural, when there are clearly very, very close ties. These societies are deeply intertwined. So it's happening at, whether you're looking at business or culture or whatever, you have to say that there is a fundamental split. There are people that want to continue to push the nationalist line to the point that they could even risk war. They don't want it, but they're willing to risk it, and they think that they can get away with it because of U.S. backing. But then on the other side, again, there's that kind of the mushy middle. A lot of people just say, let's just let things continue as they are. Let's not be provocative. Okay, let's say, promise at some time in the distant future to reunify. In the meantime, let's just trade with China. And then there are people who would really like to see it happen sooner rather than later. And I can't, I haven't looked at polls, so I can't give you percentages. It's just based on, what I know from the news and from my own experiences in Taiwan and from what I hear from your mother.
So do you think the strategy that Pete Hegseth is trying to adopt is to support this nationalist independence movement in Taiwan and push them to be more and more provocative towards China and try to get them to declare independence, and then that would trigger a response from the United States to come to Taiwan's aid?
I don't know if they actually want them to. I think they probably advise them to not actually cross the red lines. I suppose there are some people, maybe even Pete Hegseth himself, that do want war. It's clear that there are true, China hawks within the U.S. administration. It's not just the current administration, but in past administrations. They've been there for decades now, and I think they've increased in number and in passion too. And some of them want war and probably would goad the nationalists into crossing the red lines. I think most of them just would like to stop short of war. You found out actually, like in Ukraine, I think like most of the papers, think tank papers and whatever, say, we'll use Ukraine as a proxy, just to goad Russia to force it to divert resources, but let's stop just short of war because that could be pretty nasty. Let's calibrate it, and I think you're going to find the same thing in the case of Taiwan. But
why? What's the point? How does that weaken China, though? I don't understand. If anything, it makes China stronger. They gear up like, well, okay, clearly there's this threat, so we got to end up becoming stronger militarily to counter this. Yeah, why? What's the thinking? What's the logic behind it?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's very good thinking. Again, in the case of, if you look at Russia, obviously the thinking was deeply flawed. They felt that they could use Ukraine as just to pressure Russia, and of course it led to the war. And I think probably you have the same thing. It's like, okay, this is a chip that we have on our board that we can use against China. But that's foolish. The Chinese are not going to be pressured into changing their policies. And in fact, if they see greater intervention, they're just going to, their own resolve is going to increase. But we've just made this kind of mistake again and again. We don't really understand our adversaries. We have this notion, and still maybe it's just lingering attitude from the unipolar moment that we can apply pressure and thereby change the policies of our adversaries. And that's just not true anymore. Maybe it was true 20, 25 years ago, but it's not true anymore. It clearly isn't.
Right. I mean, okay, prior to the SMO, we talked about the Munich Security Conference, there is this idea adopted by the vast majority of the world that NATO in the West was omnipotent. It could impose its will. Well, we found out that didn't work out very well. It's been exposed rapidly. Not only there have we seen it being exposed, but we just lost to the Houthis in the Red Sea. And then who in the right mind's like, okay, great, now it's time to take on the Chinese.
Yeah, right, exactly.
What is the, like, I understand if, like, what happened in the Red Sea never happened. What happened in Ukraine never happened. Then you could be thinking like, maybe that's out there that, okay, maybe the US and NATO are all powerful and they can do this. And we don't know the ability of the Chinese. So I think you get away with it. Now it just seems complete suicidal. I don't understand how anybody in Taiwan could still support this. And I just don't see why anybody in the West would want this. This just seems catastrophic. It's like, I like long shots betting on the underdogs, but this is, odds 1 in a million now, like, what are we doing?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, it is extraordinary, but I guess it's just that you say pride goeth before a fall. It's just hubris. It's just, there's an unwillingness to recognize what's going on here. There's this faith that just remains unshaken on the part of many of our elite that we are the exceptional nation and there really aren't any constraints on our power. And, we can't possibly lose a war, that we choose to prosecute, if we just have the willpower. And the failures in the past is because, these were wimpy Democrats or whatever. It was, but we because we're America, we can win. You can remember the comments that like Biden made. So again, it's not just the Trump administration. It's part of the mindset of the political elite in this country going back, ever since the 90s. Yeah. I mean, it should. You're right, because what we saw, of course, in the Red Sea should have told us, if you got any ideas of fighting some sort of naval battle, because that's essentially what it would be. We would be dependent largely on naval power. This is on the other side of the ocean from us. And, it wouldn't be a ground battle. It would be a battle fought, largely by missiles. And our forces would be, our missiles would be launched in largest part from our naval vessels. And we saw how vulnerable they were in the Red Sea. We saw the evasive maneuver that the aircraft carrier had to take, and the fact that they were hiding up at the north end of the Red Sea against the Houthis. So what do they think they're going to do against China? And China has been preparing for this war forever. It's just, and I think over time, just as, is the case with Iran, time has favored the Chinese too. It's both there are these technological changes, again, that give the advantage to missiles over ships. And then there's just the fact too that they, like the Iranians, they've been building up their forces and planning for this. And again, we're talking about the largest manufacturing power in the world by far right now. So if this turns, if the war isn't decided quickly, it will be decided in time in favor of China, because China has an enormous edge when it comes to, just again, production of military munitions, just as Russia has shown, but it's just 10 times as true for China. I mean, that's just, so I don't even know what they're thinking. I agree. It's just absurd, but, all I can say again, it's hubris. It's just this, you just can't let go. You see how these people talk, everybody from Trump on down, it's just like, a lot of chest thumping and, threats and whatever. It's just, they can't let go of this idea that, that they are the undisputed hegemon. There was a time when they could get away with this, but it's that time has passed.
It's utter insanity. I mean, we talk about manufacturing capacity. Just one thing I want to remind viewers is that China has a shipbuilding capacity advantage of 275 to 1 to the United States. So if you're going to talk about a naval battle, China can outbuild you 275 to 1. And if they need to ramp up, they have the ability to scale where the US doesn't. So it's so insane. It's hard for me to believe, because you said, pride goes before the fall. It's like, well, we were just saying earlier that we already fell. That's what the Ukraine war showed. We fell militarily, we fell economically, we've fallen morally thanks to Gaza. So we already fell down. So it's like, you say it's the hubris, but
yeah, but there's still denial. I mean, it's just like in the case of, you still get a lot of people saying, I think you're starting to hear some dissident voices, let's say from the establishment, from the security communities and the State Department, some dissident voices, with regard to the Ukraine-Russia war. But you still get a lot of these statements like, okay, yeah, the sanctions haven't worked yet, but the Russian economy is just teetering on the edge, and it's going to collapse next month or next year. We keep on hearing that. And, it claims again that, okay, yeah, they're advancing, but they're advancing very slowly and they're suffering huge losses. They're on the verge of collapse. You still hear that kind of stuff. So there are ways to deny what's going on. And then, in the case of Gaza, I mean, it's hard to deny that, how our image, our reputation has fundamentally suffered. But the Israeli firsters are as passionate as ever, and they lay all the blame on anti-Semitism, and we simply just have to support them. There's denial at many different levels. I think eventually that is just going to collapse, and especially if we get in a war with China. I think, again, another thing should have been a really warning shot is that this China is not going to submit to any kind of pressure. Is, of course, the tariff war. China did not cave in. And apparently, we know the deal that was made, 30% on Chinese goods, 10% on U.S. goods, a big rollback from the 145%. Maybe some of them were up at 245, which is not really clear, but at least 145. But at the same time, China actually put restrictions on rare earths. And apparently they haven't lifted those restrictions. That's when you're talking about the negotiations. I think that's what the U.S. is trying to do, and they're not doing it. And this is what I've heard anywhere. That's what the reports are, and this is driving the Americans crazy because they're dependent on it. Like 90% of refined rare earths come from China, and the rare earths are essential to military technology. So it's just like, guys, again, but why didn't you think about this before you launched your economic war? And now the Chinese are saying, why should we send these to you? You're threatening war against us. So why should we send some sort of, absolutely essential materials for building weapons that you plan to use against us? We're not doing that. And so far they've held firm. Why shouldn't they?
It also just hammers home the insanity of any type of conflict with China. If we rely on Chinese goods and refined rare earth materials for our own military industrial complex. So do you think that if we were in a war with China, China would continue to supply the United States with what it needs to create it to keep building weapons? Of course not.
Right.
I think you told me over 50% of all weapons produced by the U.S. military-industrial complex, you have Chinese components in them, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's even more. I mean, just everything, just even things just like screws and bolts. I don't know if that all comes from China too, probably.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we can replace those.
I don't know. Not at mass, maybe. I don't know. Who knows? Yeah. It takes a while to just build up, these plants and, sure, simple things. Maybe we can spit out a bunch of washers, but, screws, they have, you got those little, it's a little more advanced.
I don't know about that, but anyway,
yeah.
No, but we are dependent. It is just crazy. It is. It's absolutely insane. But look, we have Lindsey Graham has his bone-crushing sanctions package that he has prepared, and he's claimed to have 80 senators on board for it. And that would just be an absolute, that would just end all trade with China. It would actually do the same to Europe, and it would actually do the same to the U.S., if we continue our purchases of uranium, because we actually depend on Russia for uranium. And that's one of the things that he listed. So I just don't know what planet the guy's living on. I mean, again, he's just, I remember Viktor Orban said when you're talking about the madness in Europe over the economic sanctions that, that did so much damage to Europe itself. He said, no, we didn't shoot ourselves in the foot. We shot ourselves in the lung. And that's the same thing. But they're just throughout the West, the leadership is just it's just really become detached from reality. I think maybe just being the top dog for so long, it has these consequences. You stop thinking, about hard realities, and you feel like everything is just sort of like you make your own reality. In fact, I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody in the Bush administration, the George W. Bush, that made that statement. We create our own reality. And back then, it was almost like that. You could do anything, and it might fail, but then you have this tremendous soft power, and you can just declare it a victory, or it just seemed like. So you got used to thinking without restraints and just, saying, everything is about narrative. We just, what's the point about actually worrying about the hard realities because we're the top dog? It's those, the underdog has to think hard about what's real. And I think we just stopped thinking about what's real. So, we just get these absurd proposals and policies, very self-destructive policies. And,
right.
Yeah, it could lead us into war.
Seem to be getting more and more absurd. I'm always hoping to see some glimmer of realism coming out of our elites and our establishment, but it just doesn't seem to be there. They just keep doubling down on stupid. It just, you want to shake them, be like, wake up. Hey, what are we doing here? This is insane.
Right.
How
Well,
do
you
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 wake
do
them
see
up?
it sometimes with respect to Russia under Trump. But you wonder what that is. I think some of that is actual realism. So people have studied the problem and understand what's going on. People like J.D. Vance and even Kellogg himself has made some realistic comments recently. There seems to be a glimmer of realism there when it comes to Russia. But you wonder how much of that is about pivoting to Asia, really to China, because there are all these China, uber hawks who say, yeah, Russia's not the issue, it's China. So let's just get the hell out of there and focus on China. I'm afraid maybe that realism is just perhaps just a strategic choice in favor of pursuing another kind of delusion somewhere else.
Mhm. Just going back quickly to the rare earth materials that China is not sending to the United States anymore. Obviously, this has got to put a huge amount of pressure on the United States. The military-industrial complex relies on this. So what do you think this means? They're going to try to hammer out more negotiations? China's going to play hardball? Where is this leading in terms of the trade war? Or
yeah, I know that it was a tweet that, or whatever you call a Truth Social post.
A truth.
Yeah, a truth that that Trump posted about a week ago. He expressed his frustration with the Chinese and with Xi Jinping in particular. He says, they're not compromising. What's going on here? This is really upsetting. And I think he didn't state what it was, but I think it may be about the rare earths. That was what they're, hoping that they would compromise on, and start shipping those again.
So where does this lead the United States if they can't get them?
In a real, difficult position because again, I think there's so many military technologies that are dependent on it. I think, but the thing about rare earths is that they can be used to in components that can withstand very high temperatures. I think that's one of the reasons that they're so valuable. Like in a missile that is traveling at hypersonic speeds or whatever, you have to have components that can withstand very, very high temperatures, the kind of temperatures that occur at those speeds. And that's just one example. I think there's probably other reasons why they're so valuable to military technology. Now, rare earths are found around the world. Some people say they're not rare. That's not really true. They are rare, but they're not rare in the sense that they're just concentrated in a couple of places. They're found around the world. They're rare everywhere. You could put it that way. I think they may be more common in some regions than others, or less rare in some regions than others. Just put it that way. The thing is that it costs a lot of money, and it takes a great deal of effort to extract them and refine them. And the Chinese made that investment, and so they, it's something that I'm sure that we could do, but it'd probably take at least a decade to start really producing. I don't know the exact amount of time, but it's going to, take a huge investment, a lot of time to get where we could actually be producing our own rare earths in significant quantities.
I don't think the EPA would allow it either.
Yeah, well, that's a big part of the problem. Yeah, it's strip mining. So you can't just do it, you obviously can't do it in urban land or agricultural land, because again, the cost, you're destroying land that's valuable in other ways. I'm not sure, but I think probably in China they're doing it in the Gobi Desert or some place like that.